I'm Cresa CEO Todd Licker.
I'm Craig Van Pelt, Head of Research.
We're cutting through the chaos to shed light on how businesses of all sizes can create opportunity despite the very real and changing market conditions we're seeing in today's business environment.
Let's get started.
This is Opportunity Space. On the podcast today, we have a distinct honor of hosting a leader in the world of urbanism. Joining us is Richard Florida, the renowned urbanist, pioneering researcher, and professor at the University of Toronto. He's co-founder of the Bloomberg City Lab, the leading publication devoted to cities and urbanism. Richard's an international bestseller of The Rise of the Creative Class and founder of the Creative Class Group, which advises companies such as BMW, Audi, Starwood Hotels, Facebook, Microsoft, and several others. He serves as a board member on many of the leading real estate, urban innovation, and venture capital firms across the globe. I'm a huge City Lab fan, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time. Also joining us is Craig Van Pelt, Head of Research here at Cresa. Craig has 20 plus years experience in real estate research and land use consulting. So Richard, welcome to Opportunity Space. So in your view, what's the function of a great city and why does it matter? Why should we care about cities?
Well, again, it goes back to I'm so biased on this, and my idea of a great city is Newark when I was a really little kid, or New York City when I was a teenager. And it's a city that's diverse, that has what we now, these are all words I learned in graduate school. So street level energy, a city that Jane Jacobs, a young woman who was from Scranton and moved to New York City in the 40s and 50s. It has this hustle and bustle. It has this energy. And it has what we now call third spaces, restaurants and cafes and places people go to socialize. And that's what a great city is to me. And I think as much as cities have changed, and Lord God, in the time I've been on earth, they've changed a lot, that has stayed a constant. And I think people still very much desire that, all those things, whether they live in cities like New York City or whatever, big cities, or they live in suburbs. Even in suburbs and rural areas today, people like this kind of walkability and third places and shops. And in a way, even as our cities have been challenged, certainly in my life, and then again with the COVID pandemic, many of the factors we like about urbanism, what I find so interesting is that they're now moving. They're not just in cities. We're seeing them in suburbs, in older suburbs, in newer suburbs, even in some of these rural places, the so-called Zoom towns. The ones that got really popular tend to have some of these like little tiny it's not Park Avenue or it's not Greenwich Village, but they have walkable main streets and coffee shops and antique stores. So anyway, I think those are the things that remain constants, and I think people really enjoy. Not everyone. I mean, other people have other preferences, but I think that's what makes for a great city.
Just to add on to that, one of the things that I think is really important to cities is housing, right, and living in the city. I grew up as a suburban kid with the mall in the 70s and all the disintegration of cities. But during the 80s and my early career, cities were being put back together, right? And housing is so important, right? When people live in the city and you can walk and you can get to what you want and you get to work and you have transportation, that's not the city as a destination. That's a city as a fabric of a really wonderful place to live.
Yeah, and I think, maybe you call it social infrastructure. I don't know if I have a great word for it. But all the things that push different kinds of people together, which partly we lost when we moved to more homogeneous suburbs. And suburbs have changed dramatically, right? Suburbs are now very integrated, and lots of immigrants have moved there, and there are African American. Suburbs are very different than the suburb I grew up in, or perhaps you grew up in. So I don't want to put a label on it, but I think this idea of social infrastructure and housing. And, one of the real challenges, I'm sure we'll talk more about this, is how darn expensive housing has become. And then for me, I'm talking to you from a condominium where we live part of the year in Miami Beach. We live the other part of the year in a house in Toronto. And we have two kids, 6 and 8. And in America, and I think this is true also in Canada, the dream is that you raise your kids in a suburban in a house. And I think one of the real gaps, young people love cities, and then empty nesters love cities. But in America in particular, in contrast this with, and maybe New York City, New York City is different. But in most American cities are different than in Europe or in Asia, where families live regularly in multifamily units. And I think one of the things, I often say if I had one thing that I could do over, or maybe I'll do now, is I wrote when I wrote Rise of the Creative Class about young people moving back to cities and empty nesters moving back to cities and the gay and lesbian. And that's because when I started to write that book, people wrote off cities. They thought cities were dead, right? So I saw all these groups moving back to cities. I think this emphasis on families and cities, when you said housing, family-friendly, multifamily housing is a big thing that we need to think about. And not just because I have kids now, but it's something that I think when you look at what happened during COVID, it was really the families that left cities. Most of the other people stayed. The families, I want more space. I want a yard. I want a place for the kids to run around. And we began to see that our cities, and now with the housing prices going up so high, to buy a nice condominium or a townhouse in cities is so expensive that people go, oh, maybe I can go where I can more afford it. So yeah, I think housing is critical. I just want to say, emphasize, I think multifamily housing for families is something that America needs to put front and center in its agenda.
Well, in the U.S., so we all moved out to the suburbs and we got big houses and moved further out and got bigger houses. And I think we got hooked on very big McMansions, right? Or space and cars. You go to a city, you go to New York, right? You go to San Francisco, you go to Europe, and people live in much smaller, high quality places, but they use the streets. I had an architecture professor that called it street as a room. The street is your living room, right? And your apartment is your bedroom. And that's a really interesting concept, is this idea that if you get into the city, you're living in the overall city. You're not having to create your own acreage. It's I am part of a much larger fabric, and the entire city is my front room.
And I actually think part of the affordability crisis, I often say, I'll use a different word than McMansion. And this doesn't mean anything because they've been very, everyone wants to live like a Kardashian. And I kind of like the Kardashians. I don't have anything against the Kardashians, but, they see that house, that big house. And I say to my students now, in America, we've heard about the 15-minute city. The big trend I see is the 1-minute city. The 1-minute city is the big suburban home with a home office for you and your partner, with an independent bedroom for every child, with their own little office space, with your own in-home gymnasium. And now people are putting, the TV room and the home studio room and the family room. And some people think that's rich people, but it's trickling down to the professional. Maybe I grew up in a house we probably had 1,500 square feet. My parents rented the second floor to a tenant. We had a living room, a dining kitchen, one bathroom, a bedroom for mom and dad, and a bedroom for the kids, and a yard. We thought it was like hog heaven. We were living in hog heaven. And I think what you say is so important, that what that does then is create isolation. And we know that isolation is probably one of the biggest health issues in America, especially, people are not connected. Now I think a majority or plurality of Americans are living in single member households. People are lonely. There's a loneliness epidemic. And yeah, what you really want is people to use the environment of the city, the social infrastructure, the street, the restaurants, the cafes, the meeting places. You see that in Tokyo. You see that in Hong Kong. You see that in Singapore. You see that in London. You see that in Paris. You see it in New York. You're seldom invited over to somebody's house. You go meet in a restaurant. But in most American cities, when you meet someone, you go or most American communities, you go to their house, which is lovely. But yeah, and you see it even with condominiums and apartments. People want more and more and more space. And so I think we have to get over this addiction to space. And why I think that's important is I think the more space you consume, the more it drives up the prices. So a lot of what we're seeing, look, housing is affordable and the cost of land is a big factor of that. But another part of it is that people think living in 1,200 square feet, ick. I can't live in 1,200 square feet. I need something bigger. And my hunch is that what we have to get to, especially if we want to live in denser environments, is that people have smaller amounts of space for themselves and then use shared spaces out on the street and in the community.
And that density provides a very rich experience, a very, very rich experience. Examples all over.
I'm just talking personally. I have a 6 and an 8-year-old, and you fight this. You go, oh, well, the city's dangerous. The community's dangerous. There's a homeless person here. I want to shelter them from that. I don't want them to see that. I don't want to see them police on the street. And then you think, they're going to have to grow up in this world, and I'm being really honest. And what are you sheltering them from? And that's a more rich way. So our choice is to try to embed them in diversity, but then people look at you like you're nuts. Like, I was talking to a guy today, and he raised his kids in New York, and he said, when his son was 13, to go to school, he put him on the subway. And that was probably a decade or a decade and a half ago. I think now if you did that, I might do it. People would think you're nuts, and somebody might even try to call the school board on you. But no, I think that there's a richness and a diversity. And what we've tried to do is kind of cancel that out or live in these more homogeneous environments. I understand the choice. I understand why people would feel safe in that. But in a way, it's not good for you. It's better to be exposed to the human experience. And there's, when people think about cities, when you're on that transit, I give you transit is a great example of a park. Like in New York City, and we had an apartment in New York City when our kids were and you go to the park, even in a gentrifying neighborhood, it was way different than a suburban park. There were people of every walk of life, and that's good. And, the one humanizing experience, both of our kids were born in Toronto, where there's public health care. And I'm not going to exaggerate this. We were probably when our children were born, the only middle class or professional class family in that labor and delivery ward. That was great for me. You know what I'm saying? That we all shared the same health care. And I couldn't buy a bigger room. You know what I'm saying? I just thought that was a great humanizing experience for me. And I think that exposure to humanity is what cities are great at. And I think in the United States, we've tried to erase or over navigate too much of that.
So I'm an urban planner by training. You're an architect by training. I'm an urbanist, and I love cities as well. And I read your book 20 years ago, and I reread it because I know you updated it recently, Richard. But even what stuck with me from 20 years ago, we were talking about this earlier, is you talked about the 3 T's, right? Which was technology, talent, and what I found interesting even 20 years ago was tolerance.
Yep.
And I don't think a lot of people were talking about tolerance in the early 2000s like they do today. So, that's what makes the fabric of cities unique. And different cities have different tolerance levels, and they're more or less diverse. But can you talk maybe a little bit about how that has changed over the last 20 years?
So remember, if I wrote that book published that book 20 years ago, I wrote it 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So people forget this when they come to that book now. No one expected cities to come back. Everyone at that point thought cities were dead. And what I was observing was there was this beginnings of a comeback, and that the young people I was teaching at Carnegie Mellon really like cities in ways that I did not expect. I did not expect them to say they wanted to live in these highly and I was giving talks, and I always say my mom was a simple woman, and she always talked about the 3 R's. And I had written a bunch of books and articles that nobody read except my mom and dad and my brother. And I was trying to think, I kept going in my head the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, which aren't R's. So I said, what would my mom? And I said, these 3 T's. And first, they were technology, which makes sense. I was teaching at Carnegie Mellon. There was technology, high technology companies and spinoffs. Talent was pretty easy, too, because I was always saying that in Pittsburgh, the problem we were facing in Pittsburgh was our greatest export was no longer steel and heavy industry. It was the talented kids who were growing up there or coming to Carnegie Mellon that none of them stayed. They all wanted to go to San Francisco or Seattle or Austin or New York or LA or Boston, whatever. And for a long time, I had used trade as my 3rd T. And one day, a former dean at Carnegie Mellon, said, Richard, you need to meet this guy named Gary Gates. And I'm like, great, I'll meet Gary Gates. He's a doctoral student in our program. You and him are coming to similar conclusions. He's studying the location of gay male households. He was trying to study the propagation of, he's a gay man, trying to study the propagation of the AIDS epidemic and identify hotspots of transmission and how to mitigate it. And what he was finding is that gay men tended to locate in cities with high levels of amenity. That's how my dean saw the connection. Richard, Florida is seeing college-educated people and tech workers go for amenity. Gary Gates is seeing gay men go for amenity. And I remember Gary said to me, name your 5 leading high-tech cities. And I said, well, that's San Francisco, outside of San Francisco, Silicon Valley, San Jose, that's Seattle, that's Austin and Boston. You've just named 5 of the 10 gayest cities in America. And we started laughing hysterically. And when we did that analysis that showed, and this is really important because I took a lot of criticism over this, my arguments were disassembled over this. What we were not saying is that gay people equal high technology clusters. What we were saying is the same characteristics of a place that were attractive to gay men were also attractive to this group of younger people in professions, in technology, in arts and culture that wanted a cluster of amenities. And we were using gay men, along with other indicators, our Bohemian Index of where artists and musicians are, as proximate indicators of those amenities. So we were saying there's this indirect effect, not direct effect. It's not like high-tech people are attracted to the gay community. They don't even know they exist. But they were attracted to the similar underlying characteristics. Of course, it was fun because it became a teachable moment. Like, the funny thing for you guys is, as an academic, the criticism is vociferous but polite. When I wrote this, people called me all sorts of names. They said I was inflicting a gay agenda on America. They said, how could a product of Catholic schools be undermining Judeo-Christian civilization? I was like, no, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on in cities. How have things changed? I think there's been a little bit of a backlash, to be honest with you. I think if I had to characterize this to both of you, I was a little bit naive. A kid from Newark who has experienced racism, didn't like racism, cared deeply about the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, learned later in life to care about the gay rights. I believed our society was on this upward path to a more ethical and moral high ground. And I think what we saw in the past 7 or 8 years is that maybe people didn't like it, they didn't say much, and then all of a sudden they came out of the woodwork and there was this backlash. And yeah, I think I would have been more tempered, and I think I was overly naive in believing that we had this path towards a more utopian society. And looking back, it makes sense. Rich people were moving to cities. Highly educated people were moving to cities. The creative class was moving to cities. Cities were becoming more secular and less religious and more open-minded. And then there were people like my long deceased relatives, the Italian American community and others, and other communities that were saying, no. We have more traditional values. We don't like this stuff. It scares us. And I think there's still an ongoing backlash. And that's been an interesting learning process for me to understand that our society still is divided. I didn't believe it. I couldn't process. I mean, I was naive that our society is still divided along these lines.
Well, cities have room for all of that, right? If you look at any big city, they have deep enclaves, right?
Yep.
And they could be around affinities or religious or historical or where you came from, right? And those things all live in the same city, right? And that's an important thing. So I think the tolerance is right? Because civilization, if you're going to come together, you're going to work together, there's a lot you're going to get out of it, but you have to have rule of law and basic tolerance, right? Or otherwise you're just...
the great quote, city air makes men free. City air makes men free. I mean, yeah, and I think the arc, I'll be honest with you. Look, when you go through rapid change, which is so disruptive economically and socioculturally, now it makes sense that you would have this backlash. But I think the arrow of history points in the direction, and what makes me optimistic is that look at artificial intelligence today and look at digital technology, which can do more and more. Like we eliminated most people worked on farms. Then we mechanized farms and got very productive, and now 1% of the workforce works on farms. Then most people worked in factories, and 70% of people worked in industrial-related occupations and manufacturing. Now 5 or 6% of the workforce works in production occupations. And then people started to gravitate to professional work and personal service work and service delivery. Now I think the economy depends on the unleashing of human creativity, human creative capabilities, human intellectual capabilities. That requires tolerance because creativity doesn't care about gender, race, sexual orientation, age, place of birth. Like creativity is in everybody and it's everywhere and we all have different versions of it. So my own view is very deterministic. that the economy requires creativity. If the economy requires creativity, if it means that we have to harness more creativity, that requires more diversity. So sooner or later, the competitive effect will be positive movement. But right now, I think we're in a little bit of a backtracking. And look,
But
that's okay.
we do know that the strength of the U.S. is innovation and creativity and freedom of thought, right? So
1000%.
those are things that weave their way through many generations.
This is better at that than the U.S. I mean, didn't mean to interrupt, but I'll tell you, my dad with a seventh grade education was a pretty sophisticated guy. Two quick stories. The first thing he told me is during World War II, the Russians were dismantling the machines and trying to take the machines back to Russia. And he said the American GIs were like, take the machines. But if you're a German, if you're an Italian, if you're a European who wants to come to America. And my dad always said, the mass migration of Europeans, and particularly European Jews, to the United States in the war period changed the ballgame. And the second thing he said to me in the factory, he'd take me to the factory as a little kid when I'd beg him, and he'd show me there would be Italian American, African American, Hispanic American, German American. And he would bitch. It's simple. He'd bitch about and I teach in an MBA program. He'd bitch about the MBAs and he'd bitch about the engineers. And he'd say, look at these people. Look at these people. Look at their ability. He said, these machines are terrible. Like, they're the worst machines, but look at our factory because it's there. He wouldn't call it creativity. It's them. It's in them. They know how to do this stuff and stop squelching out. Stop the MBA telling you what to do. That he saw that creativity. I learned it from him coming up from the simple factory worker. And he's like, these people know how to make this stuff. So I think I learned that from my dad. And it was in the simplest factory worker. The working class guy, my dad saw this cauldron of creativity. And I think you're right, Todd, that there's something, and I don't mean, look, this is in every society, but America has this magic at activating it.
Richard, let me ask you this. What are some examples of a dysfunctional city? What does it look like when cities stop working, right?
Well, it's so funny. So I'm from Newark. My wife's from Detroit. Historically, those would have been two examples of pretty dysfunctional cities that have turned themselves around, so much so. I've actually done some research on Newark recently, and it's the crime, the way they've mitigated crime. It was used as an example during COVID of effective policing. But Detroit, I gave a talk about 2 months ago to the CEOs of the U.S. Travel Association. And they were very concerned with what's going on in certain of our big cities, where there's been a lot of homelessness, vagrancy, urban disorder. And they asked me, not knowing my wife's from Detroit, they're like, why has Detroit rebounded? Like, what's going on in Detroit that people are going to the downtown and it's exciting and it's safe? And of course, I told them what happened and the effort. So I think what's interesting is that cities go through these waves, and maybe I love San Francisco. I love Chicago. I love some of the cities that are challenged now. And I think a lot of what we hear may be partly true and partly magnifies for political reasons. But somehow, even in cities that are far more challenged than Chicago or San Francisco are today, the Newarks and Detroit, they find a way to begin to recast themselves. And I think what's interesting is so much of the deck has been stacked against cities, right? You guys were talking about suburbanization, the incentives, the highway programs, the mortgage incentives. And even in the face of that, it's almost as if the deck was so stacked against cities, how could they come back? So yeah, and I think now maybe people are overreacting a little. I don't see the doom loop that some people see. I see some really fundamental challenges, but I don't see the doom loop. I see in most of these cities that people talk about a group of business people, foundation people, political people, civic actors, labor activists coming together and say, we want to build up our city again. So I don't see the doom loop that we saw in the 70s and 80s. But yeah, I think there are cities with some more significant challenges than I would have anticipated a decade ago.
You know what I always come back to is after 9/11, right? New York City, especially downtown, you would have written that off easy enough to do, right? And then look just a few years later, right? And what is it? It's talent. It's young, smart, educated people who choose a place to live. And guess what? We all follow, right? We're in the office space business. We help companies find the right environment. We follow talent, right? Look at lifestyle cities, right? we're talking about cities today that you would have written off 20 years ago, right? Some of these mid and small size cities, you would have written them off, right? What do they have to offer, right? And now they're vibrant places. Why? Because they're following talent.
So it's funny, and I mean that's one thing I'll give myself a little credit for. This whole idea that talent matters is an argument that I tried to make 25 years ago when people thought I was insane. Like they thought if you got the jobs, that people would come, and I was like, no, people have choice. And I think one of the things the pandemic did is it was a giant experiment in giving these digital technologies gave us more choice. And it gave not everyone, not less fortunate people, not essential workers, but affluent people, educated people, and the creative class got a lot more choice and a lot more leverage. But I think there's something that I find a constant, and I don't think it's changed. And I'd love, and we could talk about this because you guys are far more expert in this than me. 25 years ago, when I asked people what they want in a great place to work, I heard this answer. And when I ask people this tomorrow, recently I'll hear the same answer. I want to work on great projects with great people in great spaces, in great places. And I think people heard remote work and they thought, oh, well, we're like us. I'm in my little study, which is we can make this a guest room. It's my study. It has a camera and it has a little shelf. And I do Zooms from here, whatever, conversations from here. Everyone's going to stay there. But no, what I keep hearing is, yes, there's times I want to work flexibly. There's times I want to work from home. There's times I want to work for wherever. But I want to work in great spaces and great places. And I want to emphasize this. Great spaces and great places were the most important. People told me and continue to tell me what's a differentiator in the company I work for is that it's a great space and a great place. And I think what happened, which you guys know better than me, people somehow mistook a cubicle farm in a giant vertical tower for and that's not a great space. I called that, the last vestige of the industrial age. That's a horrible space. That's an inhuman space. And I always tell the story where I was invited up to WeWork in the old days. And fortunately, I didn't have to do body shops with Adam, so it was a good day for me. And I hit my wife. I elbowed her. And I said, this creative class shit really worked. What I saw in that headquarters environment was a place that people wanted to be. Now, I think that was just you know much more about that. That's just the beginning. The whole work environment is much less what we think of as the industrial age office and much more a place of coming together, meeting people, social. It's almost like more like hospitality than office. I have all the wrong words for it. It's more like your living room than your classroom. And I think we haven't figured that out. I think you guys are at the cutting edge of it. And then what is the portfolio of spaces that human beings need to be in, right? I'm in one in my house now, but I'd go stir crazy if I was in this one in my house 24/7. What are the others? Some of which are a corporate or a corporate affiliated office, some of which is a third space or a third place, a coffee shop or restaurant or something else. And how do you manage, both as an individual and as a business, that portfolio of spaces? And I think we're only now, and that's why I'm glad we're talking, we're only now getting to that point where we understand it's not about a space, it's about a portfolio of spaces.
Yeah, I think what we saw during the pandemic was just a forced disintegration of the workplace, right? And I don't say that in a bad way, right? Because there's a lot of things we picked up, but there's an awful lot of things we picked up. Technology adoption and the ability to focus and destroying commutes. And there's an awful lot that got done. Now I think what you're seeing is starting to put it back together, right? If you run an organization, if you're in an organization that's based on the collective work of a number of people in different departments, there is a convening that has to be done. Sometimes it has to be done to get work done. Sometimes it has to be done to train and cross-pollinate. But the convening is a big part of it, right? Just being all on the Zoom won't do it.
We need each other's energy. Like it's you just get down, and don't get me wrong. There's times where I don't want to be around anyone. I'm writing, I'm focused. But when I was writing Rise of the Creative Class, this story, somebody told me the story of this famous physicist who worked at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study. He would be in his office, and then he would get bored and he'd start roaming the hallways and finding people to talk to. And anyone, like the assistant, the graduate student, because he needed, I find the same thing. Like I have to go for a walk, I have to go for a bike ride. And then somebody said, no, this isn't about a walk and a bike ride. It's about resetting your mind for a second working day. Human beings do not thrive in isolation. And I think I love the way you put the disintegration. The office is a cubicle for isolation. That doesn't work. It's not even an office, right? Where does the office come from? It comes from the London cafe. It's some mechanism for giving you social energy. And I think what's interesting is no one's quite figured the portfolio. I mean, we're seeing this experiment in real time. It's not a coffee shop. It's not just a co-working space. It's something new. And you see the gravitational pull of it. And I think you're so right. What's so hard in the US, of course, is that the young people need this. And then people our age who have families go, well, I bought that big house out in the suburbs. I'm commuting 45 minutes, and that's horrible. And we have this demographic divide. So yeah, and I think you're right. I just looked at the Placer data, and I always think if you're going to say that New York is dead, that's the great way. It should end your career, but it never does. Like it's a prediction you always get wrong. But it showed that Placer data showed that New York City had one of the highest, if not the highest, back to office rates. I think Miami was second. And that's interesting because Miami has been under officed, right? It was the highest back to office rate in a place that you would argue is pretty over officed. I thought that was really interesting about this getting back, that people are getting back. And it takes a while. I mean, I studied pandemics. These are multi-year phenomenon of getting back. There's a big
thing about New York. New York is such a good example. So New York during the pandemic, right? Rents went down 40%, right? And then 6 months into the recovery, rents were up 40%, right? and then it peaked above that, right? So that's really interesting. So back to work lags, but I think a lot of it has to do with reinventing what the work is. But people, in terms of just look at rent and housing stock, people are in New York, and it's significant.
What you're talking about is what people want now that they've had it is choice and control. And now that they've had both of those things, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle for people, because I think the more people I talk to, they want an option. They don't want to just work at home. They want the option to come in, but they want it when they do come in. It's got to be meaningful. There's got to be a reason to draw them.
It's a portfolio of spaces.
Yeah,
I think you're onto
exactly.
something with that term. And I think the other thing you're onto is that if you're younger, if all of us were 23, the company's doing a disservice to us, isolating us. And we have a podcast with a Stanford professor, and he says you can't recruit the best and the brightest young people unless you're going to bring them into an office, unless you're going to bring them into an environment where they'll learn from others.
That is so constant. Great projects with great people in great spaces and great places. That, I don't know how people forgot that, but if you talk to these kids, because I do, they will not go to a place that's remote only. Now, maybe I would, because I'm older and I have 2 kids, 6 and 8. You might hear them yelping around in the background. But the youngsters, these young, talented kids, great spaces and I think what you said is so important. It's choice of that space. And it's not a space. It's multiple kinds of spaces that fit my mood and fit the day I'm going to work. And, it was so funny when writing Rise of the Creative Class, I was asking kids about nightlife, and they're like, no. We're not baby boomers. We don't want to get hammered, which I found really interesting. We need 24/7 nightlife because we're working so hard. We never know, like if we want to go to a show or go to a concert, or we want to be in a city. It's almost that the city offers that choice of spaces. Like, we don't know, maybe we want to go to the office today. Maybe we want to work from home. Maybe we want to go to this cool coffee shop. And I always use the same example. When I started to work, everything was wired. I was tethered to my desk. There was a phone, there was a computer wire, and there was an assistant who gave me those pink things. There's my office. I take it wherever I go. So I'm untethered. Wouldn't I, like you just said, have choice and want to exercise choice? And where you see it the most, I mean, look at super rich people or at business leaders. Look at Jeff Bezos deciding he wanted to live part of the year in Miami, even though his headquarters are in Seattle, and he built another one in Washington, D.C. the people who have the capability for the most choice want to exercise it the most. So it makes sense to me that people want more choice.
And I think so. Our clients tend to be the heads of real estate, corporate real estate for those companies, right? And it used to be that what they thought about was cost. It still is, but it's not number one. Number one is accessing talent. And we have seen, I think it shocked us all, the fast rise of the sort of job crunch or the talent crunch. We knew it was coming demographically, you could see it coming, but the fast rise of the talent crunch. And now there's never been a tighter connection between space and portfolio places and workplace and company branding and access to talent. And that's a great thing for us because it gives you're serving a higher purpose, right? Look, real estate's 10% of the cost of labor, right? And really great labor is in the driver's seat, right? For how it wants to work, where it wants to work, and what it will be paid. And we, again, are following talent, which is a great thing.
Yeah, and I think there is a revolution. It's funny. I'm an urbanist. I guess 20 years ago, I started to talk to residential real estate developers about how to build housing to attract the creative class. And they were very flattering and said, your book is so important to us. To be honest with you, it's only with the pandemic that I started to talk to people in the office business. And I think there's a reason for that because the industry didn't rest on its laurels. There was beautiful space and beautiful corporate space and beautiful law offices, and the Googles of the world, understood that they made these places with the cafeterias and the foosball tables. And then they moved to the city, to New York, because they knew there was talent there. But I think there's now what you just said, this recognition that it's not an office. We don't have quite the word for it, but that this space is really important to attracting talent. And that's why we get so much of the noise and the dialogue. Offices are dead. Commercial real estate's dead. No, nonsense. Crappy, shitty, sorry for my French, crappy, shitty cubicle farms are dead. Great spaces are more alive than ever, and people need them because we're more isolated than ever. So then what are we going to invent to be those spaces?
Let me ask you this. So cities are undergoing all this change, right? And there has been a real sort of repositioning of office in the CBD. How do cities wrestle with this change when office has retreated in many ways, right? Not fully, but partially. And how do they think about the fabric of their cities going forward?
So first, don't get freaked out. This is a necessary culling. You said it's the disintegration. You said that nicely. This is look, I have a book here on my shelf. I think it's fantastic. It's by Robert Fogelson. It's a history of downtowns. I don't know if people can see it. The title is Downtown, Its Rise and Fall, 1880 to 1950. Fogelson thought that the traditional downtown CBD was dead in 1950. I think he's right. Because this book is now my Bible. I think the rise of when I say this, not my book, the rise of the creative class, this creative outburst in the 1990s and 2000s actually was a Band-Aid, where it artificially propped up the conventional office, the conventional CBD. But if you look more deeply, what you begin to see is it was already changing. Lower Manhattan added residence, it added hospitality, it added restaurants. I was part of it, as a New Yorker and a person who went to school in New York. I was part of those charrettes arguing Lower Manhattan should be a creative engine. And in fact, that new building, the new performance center, people say is one of the greatest things that's happened down there. And the second thing that happened, of course, is the CBD started to move. It was no longer the professional office tower district like Midtown. It started to go out. Chicago River North, Chelsea, Flatiron, Tribeca, Soho. Google's not in the CBD. It's in, whatever you call it, that area of Soho, Hudson Square, I forget the name of it. It's in the Port Authority building. The high-tech companies almost started to follow the artists to the old loft and industrial buildings. So I think the CBD was changing, and you used the best example of deindustrialization. That was an existential challenge. Like when cities lost their industrial base And, cities remade themselves. It took a decade or two or three. This is not quite the existential challenge, but it means, I think, one, that the traditional CBD has outlived its shelf life. It's now becoming something bigger, and I call it a central connectivity district. Others call it a central social district, a central recreational district. I like my word, a place for humans to connect. But I think it's growing in space and size, that the platform of the workplace of the city is growing, and it's expanding outside that CBD. And then, of course, residential conversion and an emphasis, I think, on third spaces. According to that study I wrote about that Paul Levy did, office is back 75 to 80%. Residential in the 26 downtowns he studies are back over 100%. There was only one downtown less than 100%. And visitors are really important. And I think that's been a big learning for me. I don't think I ever thought, I never really figured out how important local and non-local visitors are to the center of a city. And so that's something that cities should really think about, not just live, work, but live, work, connect, and how important that visitor, both the business tourist and the local tourist are.
In those cities, New York's a fantastic example. The number of B and C grade, what we would call in office terms, B and C grade buildings that are interesting, complex, small, in neighborhoods, right? That you could see. Just go to Paris for a while or go to any major European city and half the Asian cities, and you'll see if that comes alive with people living in different textures, all of a sudden the CBD, it's just like downtown was in the 80s, right? Used to be a place you go to work and then leave, or every downtown in the 70s. Once you start adding housing, right, and the other things around it and the experiences, the whole thing starts stitching back together.
Yeah. And I think, I'm sitting here in Miami Beach, now people thinking about, well, we can put office near Lincoln Road. We can put office near Sunset Harbor. Now they're smaller, they're more boutique-y, they're not big, conglomerations, but people seem to love that. And I remember that meeting I told you at WeWork. I'm there with all the top executives, right? And the first thing I say is, why aren't you putting these things in the suburbs? There's a lot of people in the suburbs who work in the suburbs, men and women, a lot of moms who would love some other kind of space to go to work in. And they laughed at me. They thought it was the funniest thing they ever heard. They were on the floor thinking, this guy's lost his mind. But now you see this demand for higher quality. And even in the report on the future of New York City that Dr. Off and the other deputy mayor did, fascinating. They talked about repositioning the CBD, but moving employment zones. Now, that didn't include Connecticut and New Jersey, because it was a study of New York City, moving more work out to Brooklyn, out to Queens, out to the Bronx, out to Staten Island. I think this is what's so interesting. You have the opportunity to create more and better workspace closer to these residential centers, and I almost think they need it more. And then in the center core and in the urban core, you make the brand, I think of retail, the brand, the really spectacular thing, where people go to connect with one another and meet with one another. And I think it's probably less about workspace. I don't want to say that because I like a workspace, but it has to be a lot about connection space, connectivity space. And I think this. We're seeing this in real time. People are now figuring this out. Yeah, we can do this.
Well, and what's happened to us is younger folks, millennials and others, have taken their expectations of their environment to the suburbs, to these lifestyle cities.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see, right? It's interesting to see things that look like they could have been in Soho now in the suburb or in another city. And that's a good thing, right? They're bringing the best of where they came from.
Well, the thing, when I wrote The New Urban Crisis, I went on a book tour. And this is 15 years after Rise of the Creative Class. And I went back to many of the same small cities, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, Columbus, these Tulsa, and I'm like, holy shit. What happened? Everyone I went to had spectacular restaurants, never mind Nashville, spectacular restaurants, spectacular great boutique hotels, Louisville, Kentucky. I could go down the list. I could chapter and verse. I'm like, and then I now do a lot of work in Tulsa with the Kaiser Family Foundation. And then it became obvious. Well, you got a lot of great chefs here because the space is affordable. And then I heard Danny Meyer say one day to New York, he said, I don't think I could make it in New York any more space. So what happened, I think, Jane Jacobs would have figured this out right away. Cities got, the big cities, the New Yorks, the Londons, the San Franciscos got so expensive. And this creative revolution, right, lifestyle revolution went on so much that people started to go first to Nashville and Austin, but then they got expensive. Then it just goes down the line. And what's so interesting about the pandemic is you started to see this in rural areas. That's the one place I wouldn't have expected. You started to see now these rural areas with the little main streets become fascinating places, you know, and I do think it's right that people have taken their expectations and it may be, see, the United States might be unique in that we may have a spatial division of labor that's different than Europe. That what we might have is these big, giant superstar cities for the young and the ambitious. Now, don't get me wrong. There'll still be young and ambitious people who choose to stay in New York City or San Francisco or LA. But many of them might say, I want more affordability. And in the past, they would have gone to the suburban catchment zone. Now they go, oh, I could go to Miami, Austin, Nashville, Tulsa, Bozeman, Jackson Hole, Park City. I mean, I can go I can go almost anywhere, or Hudson Valley, Hudson River towns. And I think maybe you get this, then when there's a family, people go to these lifestyle centers. And then when they're empty nesters, they make a third choice. This idea of multiple locations over a life cycle, I find fascinating. And that might be more the case in the US, where if you're in London or Paris, you stay there. But if you're in the US, you go from big city to lifestyle center back to big city, something like that. And we'll see. Only time will tell.
I think there's something to be said for it. The big cities, I still look at them like big engines, right? When you're going to make your career, to make your name, to learn, to figure out, to go deep on something, to create wealth, it's hard not to go to a big city and do that, right? But you may not be there forever. And those, I think there's a level of economic engine and social engine there, as well as all the other things that work for transportation, housing, and everything else that will continue. And we'll bring them back. But you're right, they're part of a larger national organism, which is pretty fun.
And for organizations, that's a challenge. Like I met Peter Jackson right after I wrote Rise of the Creative Class when I gave a speech in New Zealand. I went to visit him in Wellington, and he's like, when I was a young filmmaker, I had to live in LA. I couldn't live, but when I became Peter Jackson, I could move. And I think the hard part of organizations now is once you've developed your network, your mid-career, you can move. But I think what the hard part is then those younger people suffer from the lack of mentoring or acculturation. And I think that's a huge organizational challenge. How do you do that when different groups in the career cycle are making different living choices?
Well, but recognizing that's the work to be done is the first step, right? That's when we come back to it's convening. And you're not convening for convenience sake. You're convening to drive the organizational, supply chain. Hey, look, this has been tremendous, right? We've just gotten started. We could go all day. But look, my takeaways are cities are important parts of civilization. They always undergo change. They continue to undergo change. And there's a real interesting dynamic going on now, both in the biggest cities and in the smaller cities and the entire nation. We know when it comes to workplace and development of cities is very, very important. And we know that ultimately a successful city follows talent. Right. Yep. And so you keep an eye on talent and you're pretty good chance that something's going to happen good in that city.
I started with some stories about my mom and dad. Let me tell you why I have great hope in cities today. When I started working on cities, I worked in an intellectual ghetto. If I said I worked on cities, people were like, what? You study cities? Are you like an urban planner? Who cares about that? Now you go to a dinner party or a cocktail party, and you tell people, where should I move? Where do I go? I'm thinking about these cities. I've never thought about anything. All I care about is where am I going to go? I'm going to go to Miami, Nashville. I'm going to go. Like, I've never seen this subject. I started when nobody cared, and now it's all everybody wants to talk about. That's the signal to me that this is the greatest time to be, like, I just feel like the luckiest person in the world. Like, I started because I love it, and nobody cared about it. Now everybody wants to talk about it. So yeah, I think we're on to something. And these predictions that cities would somehow go away were wrong to begin with. And now I think it's emerging on everybody that they're not. And it's just great to talk to you guys. So let's keep talking.
Yeah.
You bet. So, Craig, thank you very much. Richard, thank you very much. This was really fantastic. And
Awesome.
thanks for joining us, everyone, on this version of Opportunity Space podcast. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one.